All right, people, what was it like in early America? What was the religious backdrop for early America? That's what we're going to be talking about today here with Ben. And we are just going to talk about at least some of the major, not all of it, obviously, but some of those major themes, the major people that were involved. And what we look back at and say that those are the ancestors of America and kind of their religious heritage that was passed on just in the early days, just to kind of get an understanding of that. So,
Right.
I don't know. Do you want to talk about Jamestown? Is that really
Well, I
how
mean,
big of an impact does that have really on the religious front?
the interesting thing about Jamestown, I think, when we talk about religion in the colonies, is how the focus of Jamestown is so different than, say, Plymouth.
Right.
Because Jamestown is business. It's about business. It's about making money. And so some of the ways that colony is handled, uh,
Disregard for human
you,
life.
you look at how we treat Native Americans, things like that. It's not born in Plymouth. It's born in Jamestown.
Right.
Um,
Corporate greed, that
yep.
kind of that idea.
Just some of the ideas that come with, when John Smith takes over the colony, he who doesn't work doesn't eat.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a religious background for that saying, but at the same time, it's more of a heavy-handed.
It's just an authoritarian cry. Like, you think he's using religion for control rather than actually
Right.
wanting to practice Christianity?
Yeah, but I've actually been to the 1617 church there in Jamestown. Pretty cool. I think that may not be the right year.
Yeah.
But it's pretty cool because that it's the old school church where you would bury the people at the front of the building underneath where the pastor
like
would
the
stand.
portico, yeah.
Right. There's even a knight, an actual knight that's buried on that site. So
There's English traditions.
Yep,
brought over.
very much.
Yeah. But so if we go then to, let's say, the Pilgrims, 1620, they come over, and their reasoning for coming to the New World is their reasoning is different than Jamestown.
Right. Now they were supposed to arrive in Jamestown. I mean, that was where they were supposed to settle, just north of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually my great grandfather's fault. John Clark was the pilot of the Mayflower, and they were off course.
Yeah.
So, their motivation was.
It's primarily religious.
It's religious. It's escaping persecution, so to speak.
Yeah, it wasn't because they were complete separatists.
They were separatists
from the Church of England, which they didn't want to be a part of that.
It's very interesting when you look at that colony's formation. When you have Puritans later coming, they're not separatists. They're different. But the Pilgrims, in most people's view of American history, they get kind of merged in with the Puritans.
That's right.
And that's
because the Puritans don't come. It's 10 years. I think 1630 when the Puritans come.
Right.
And they're wanting to purify the Church of England.
Right.
Right. So
separatists want to break away from it.
That's right. Break away from it completely. But what's interesting about that is they didn't like the king's control and domination over religion. They wanted freedom to practice religion.
Right.
And you think, okay, well, that's the end of the story then, for where it comes from our freedom of religion. But that's not really the case, is it? I mean, because
no,
the way those colonies develop.
Well, in fact, that division where you had the Puritans and the separatists, one of the reasons the separatists merge in is because there's so many more Puritans, and the Puritans enforce their rule.
Yeah.
So it's the religious freedom that we speak of doesn't come from that source, because
no, they wanted to enforce their version.
That's right.
So they wanted it to be just like it was in England, except they wanted to control it.
Right. I mean, you have people being ousted from the colony, like Anne Hutchinson, or people like that, who had differing opinions, different views of that.
Yeah.
And they end up going to Rhode Island, which we're probably going to talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about Rhode Island in a bit, because Rhode Island was accepting of many different people. It's so funny because it's such a small place
comparatively
compared to the rest of the
I mean, when you
colonies.
think about Massachusetts at the time, that included Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, all of that area. That was all Massachusetts. It wasn't just
That's right. It
the
wasn't
little
confined to
the little
same town
section that was today. Yeah.
I was thinking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans and their disdain for the king at the time.
And that leading into the American thoughts there, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of it. I think it plants a seed, at least for later revolution,
right?
Somewhat maybe.
So that would have been James.
That would have been King James.
Yeah,
correct. And that's what's funny about that, because as a tidbit, just a side note, the Pilgrims and the Puritans would have come over with the Geneva Bible,
right?
And we
no
know
King
that.
James.
No. However, if I might get a King James only apologist who watches this, it is possible that there was a man named John Alden, all right, who wasn't a separatist,
right,
but came over on the Pilgrim's boat.
Okay.
All right, his name was John Alden. And later it was found that he had a King James version of the Bible. In fact, it's in the Museum of the Pilgrims, I think. But
oh, wow.
It's printed in 1620.
Right. Well,
that's the year they left.
Yeah, and the date on the actual translation would be 1611. So.
Sure. Well, no, but it already had a revision in 1617.
Right.
But the print date on the title page is 1620. So there's some dispute over whether that actually came over on the Mayflower or whether it came by different means later and he got a copy of it. But nonetheless, he was not a part of the separatist movement, so it's very possible that he could have had a copy of the King James version.
Right. Well, that would have been coming through Anglican and or Presbyterian sources.
That's right. Because he was he did something with the cargo. He made barrels and things like that. He was a worker on the boat.
Okay.
And he stayed when they got there. He was supposed to go back, so it's possible he had it with him.
Well, that's kind of like my ancestor. My ancestor's the driver. He doesn't really, the pilot of the boat. He doesn't really stick around with the Pilgrims necessarily. Now his children end up settling in the Plymouth area.
Well, this fella ended up staying and joined them. Okay, at some point. But the interesting note about that is, the popularity of the King James Bible later. Like at that moment in early America, is in those regions anyway, it would have been, almost blasphemy to think that you would have had a King James Bible, because he was so reviled, and it was very new. The Geneva Bible was.
I think even for the Puritans that would be true.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
For both cases, and it was 1560 when the Geneva Bible was produced, and it was the first one that had numbered verses.
Yep.
And it was also translated from Hebrew and Greek, and it was really the first one to do that, because you had the Great Bible before that.
We're going back to Wycliffe at some point.
You do, like Tyndale and others.
Yeah.
But the Great Bible, I think it was covered. Well, Coverdale helps with the Geneva. Anyway, the Coverdale, Tyndale, all these other guys are involved in translations too. But some of them are really going back and just translating out of the Latin Vulgate. And when you get to the Geneva Bible, they've sort of got a handle on what to do with it, how to make that happen. The problem, but the Great Bible, by the way, is Henry VIII. Right. That's his authorized version. Of Scripture. So people think the authorized version, it means that it's one book, but that's not true. What happens is, by the time King James comes along, everybody has their own scripture, all these different kings and kingdoms. So it's like, well, it's my turn to get one. Yeah, you're right. So you've got, but Geneva Bible, though, is Calvinist influence. John Calvin is influencing what's happening. I think it's Coverdale and somebody else, now their name is slipping in my mind, but they're producing, the Geneva Bible, and in the margins they're putting notes from John Calvin,
like a study Bible.
It is a study Bible. And when it starts to arrive, when people have it in England and King James is looking at it, he called it seditious.
Yeah,
he said this was, it was bordering sedition for you to even read these things, because they called kings tyrants. and he didn't like
A
that.
Calvinist view of the divine right of kings would have been very different
than what James thought,
right.
because James was saying, that this divine right of kings, that was his focus.
Yeah,
right.
no doubt.
But and he's such a funny individual too. I know we're kind of going off on King James for a minute, but that is what's happening in the early days. It's all about English kings for the early colonies, right?
Right.
I mean, James and then later.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is before the Glorious Revolution, so
That's
I mean, you've got an English king who definitely thinks that God has put him on the throne, and anybody arguing with that is the seditious.
Either he really, I don't know if he really thinks it or if he used it for his advantage, and this is the reason why I say that,
right?
Because he's King James VI of Scotland,
Right, he's already king,
and then at the time his mother
had to sign her death warrant in order to get that position.
That's right. His mom was Mary, Queen of Scots,
right?
And she baptizes him as an infant into the Catholic Church.
Right.
But whenever he becomes king, he's extremely young.
Right.
Becomes king, and it's a Presbyterian ceremony. And he is a Presbyterian along with the country, the nation.
Yes, Church of Scotland.
Church of Scotland is Presbyterian.
Right.
So influenced by what we were just talking about a bit ago, John Calvin.
Yep.
And the Geneva Bible. So there's a connection there. He would have had no problem with it
prior to becoming the King of England.
That's right.
You're absolutely right.
All of a sudden, he's like, in fact, he's telling people that this Anglican church, if you look at some of his writings, is a problem, right? It's a stain on the earth. There's all these other issues. He doesn't like it, doesn't agree with it. And then suddenly he realizes that, wait a minute, I can be King of England. So he promptly moves to England and takes over there as King James I.
We're also talking about the Anglican Church post Elizabeth also.
That's right.
So that's another big change. From Henry VIII to Elizabeth, it becomes more Protestant in nature.
It does.
It
becomes more, because early on it was just the king is the head of the church instead of the Pope, but then it does take on some Protestant qualities in it.
The Book of Common Prayer, things like that.
That's right. But yeah, it's funny. He takes over and then he immediately says that the Geneva Bible is a problem. And that other stuff I used to believe is terrible. Well, I am the head of the church.
Right.
And I need to authorize my own copy of Scripture. And he does so. And it's the 1611 version. He's had, I believe, 100 people on this committee to translate the Scriptures. But it's at about this moment in time, though, that the Protestant Reformation is kicking into high gear, and there's tons of groups sort of splintering off everywhere.
Right.
And it's why we have the Pilgrims who go away.
What year was Luther?
1516.
1516, you got Luther.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you've got Luther, you've got Calvin, you've got Jacob Arminius, you've got these various different people.
Who is a Calvinist.
That's right, who was a Calvinist also. And I think that the reason I wanted to get back to the Calvinist idea that James is rejecting, right? Yeah, I know, there's something out there. James is rejecting that Calvinist idea. But that is something that the Pilgrims, and I think the Puritans also would have accepted more readily. Right. Because they were going to create this city on the hill.
Yeah, I mean, both of them really have a Calvinist theology to most intent.
That's right. It's not fatalistic, but it is divine providence.
Right.
I mean, that's why we have places like Providence, Rhode Island.
Right.
It's
well, I mean, the Baptist level of Calvinism. That's right. That's going to come in.
And later, though, I think even the imprint of manifest destiny is present from the get-go.
Oh yeah.
Because God favored us to come here and to start this thing.
He allowed it to happen.
That's right. And so what we need to do is to make sure that we can enforce this on not only for ourselves, but for the citizens of this land.
For the whole world, right?
That's right.
We're the city on a hill is supposed to shine for the world to see.
That's right.
And I definitely think the Puritans had that mentality.
That's right. Yeah, I think it directly leads to manifest destiny ideas.
Yeah.
Later.
I think back on the subject of the Pilgrims being a different group than the Puritans, that's kind of part of all of that, right? Like, I don't think the Pilgrims necessarily would have been gung ho for Manifest Destiny. They're separatists. They're more like what we would later interpret as Baptist theology. And so they're more just, let's survive.
That's right.
They're
friendlier. They get along better with the Native Americans.
Right. Well, some of them.
Some of them.
They actually band together with one group and actually
fight others,
take out another tribe, that's basically. Right.
But they considered them their friends at that moment.
Right.
So yeah, it's a complicated thing what's happening in early America, but right. Nonetheless, that's sort of the backdrop, right? And then if that stays kind of the backdrop, except geographically, depending upon where you were along that eastern seaboard,
right,
it would determine what religion you could practice.
Right.
Right.
If you're in Jamestown, you're in the early Jamestown colony, you're Anglican. There's nothing.
There's no way around it.
But just north of that, where you've got William Penn coming in and setting up his colony.
That's right.
The Society of Friends allows all comers.
Sure.
But there's even a time where there's religious persecution there, though. So that's an interesting. Pennsylvania is probably the most religiously free colony that we've ever had, and yet there was still some. When all the mixing of the different groups comes in.
Close.
True.
But it's
from a denominational standpoint, I would say your more non-denominational idea comes in, Pennsylvania.
That's true. That's true.
So,
in fact, there were Catholic regions and all too.
Maryland is
Maryland specifically
set up by Lord Baltimore as a Catholic colony.
That's right.
More of a safe haven because Catholics in England would have been kind of on the radar of the king and the Anglicans trying to oust them, so to speak.
That's right.
You had Mary the First, which it was exact opposite. You have Elizabeth, her Catholic sister. Her Protestant sister comes in and changes the church, and then James is kind of somewhere in the middle of all that. Right.
Yeah, there's this back and forth. It's that family was odd.
Right.
Essentially, all three children are completely different in almost every way, in the way that they ruled, and their attitudes, their behaviors, and in their religious affiliation.
Well, and speaking of that, that's a change in the family from the Tudors to the Stuarts. Mm-hmm. That's where that occurs. Mary's connection, Queen of Scots, her connection goes back to Henry VII. Mm-hmm. And then she's actually a Stuart. And so James is the first of the Stuart line.
That's right.
So that there is a familial change there, even though they are related. There's
that's right.
A major
change of crosses over
right
to the matriarchal side,
right?
Potentially. So these early colonies, right? They begin to develop, and we lead to the point of, we don't want to get into all of the political stuff, but gets to the point where we're thinking, we need to declare some independence, from.
That was a big jump.
Yeah, well, I kind of have to speed up.
You do, yeah.
But let's just fast forward through that, okay? Let's fast forward to when the colonies are looking to separate, right? What's in the air at the moment that is religious in nature?
Let's back up for just a second, mm-hmm. and let's talk about Roger Williams and
Roger Williams and Providence.
So. He's a separatist.
That's right.
Separatist, more similar to the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and he comes along seeking to found his own colony apart from that.
That's right.
With the purpose of religious freedom. Mm-hmm. He has a better view of how to treat Native Americans. I would say more in line with Scripture than
he lives with them.
Right. So
that was the Narragansett drive, I believe
that's correct.
Yeah.
Just dissatisfied with what's going on
in other
places.
And I can briefly say something about that too, that I neglected to mention earlier. But yeah, so he comes and founds, First Baptist Church, Providence, Rhode
Island. It is the first.
It is literally the First Baptist. I know you go to every city and there's First Baptist Church, but it is literally the First Baptist Church in the United States.
In fact, we all pattern our steeple after theirs.
That's right.
If that's a thing, right?
But yeah, he's dissatisfied because of the way that things are. these people who we look at and say, well, they were coming here to get religious freedom. They were, but only for themselves,
right,
not for everybody else. And some of the proof of that is just looking at what happens in the early days, you
right,
know, and that because you mentioned Providence, it reminds me of Obadiah Holmes, who
right,
later becomes pastor of that church.
right,
And Obadiah was born in Salem, Massachusetts,
right.
the same Salem of the witch
Witch
trials
trials,
later
right,
on. So he got out of there before that happened.
right,
But so Obadiah is there for a while. He starts to get cross with the locals
right,
for religious reasons.
right.
He's not able to practice.
And he would preach, from my understanding. And
Yeah.
and doesn't he?
He
gets like whipped in the mouth, something.
well, that's later.
Yeah,
Yeah. So he's there. He moves to Rehoboth and stays there for a couple of years. I think glassmaking or something there.
okay,
And he ends up in the same situation. He thought it would be better.
right,
It really wasn't. And so he ends up moving to Rhode Island. And he's in Rhode Island. He's part of Baptist church there. And he meets friends, John Clark and John Crandall. And he's there for a while, and they're plugged into this Baptist church in Rhode Island. And they find out that one of their dear friends is over in Massachusetts. He's near Boston. I think it's the town of Lynn, Massachusetts. And they decide, let's travel and go to see this guy. We haven't seen him in a while. He's an older man. He's not doing well. So these three men, Obadiah Holmes, John Crandall, John Clark, they travel from Providence, Rhode Island to Boston. And they get there, they visit with him. And while they're visiting with him, he says, you know, I'd love to participate in like Lord's Supper, you know, together with you guys. And so they promptly did that. Well, someone finds out, right, about this in Massachusetts. And those three men are arrested.
Just to add a caveat, we're definitely talking Puritan Massachusetts.
That's right.
Right.
They are arrested. Not just, hey, we don't want your kind here. It's not persecution or anything like that. It's they are arrested, and they're charged with practicing religion without a license.
Yeah.
So they were practicing the ordinances without a license, and the only way that you could get a license to dispense sacraments
from the colony
is from the colonial government, and the colonial government actually had religious tests for office.
So there's no separation of church and state.
There's no separation of church and state at all.
Right. Speaking of which, the separation of church and state, when Jefferson later writes the letter, that's to Danbury.
That's right.
And that's in Connecticut, correct?
That's right.
Connecticut shares more in common with Rhode Island in terms of religion, I believe.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
It does. But these three men are there, and some friends decide they want to bail them out, and they can pay this fine, and they'll let them go. They just have to give them money. John Clark and John Crandall, their bonds are paid. Obadiah Holmes figures out what's going on. He says that he did not accept payment for himself, and he refused. He said, we shouldn't have to pay for this. This doesn't make any sense, right? So he stays in jail for weeks. And then finally, at the end of that process, he is sentenced. And they took him to State Street in Boston, and there's what's called a whipping pole there. They strap him to that pole, and he's given 30 lashes. And he is almost crippled by this beating that he gets. For the next 6 to 7 weeks, he can't sleep in any position other than on his knees and elbows because it's that bad, and he was hunched likely for the rest of his life from the beating that he gets in this place. Right. And this is from going to someone's house and administering sacraments, right, without permission from the Massachusetts State Church. Right, or the colony church anyway.
Which, not to get into that argument, but one would have considered it sacrament, one would have considered it ordinance.
That's right.
So I mean, there is that presence there, but
so there are these differences, and he goes back home and then becomes pastor of the church there in Providence, Rhode Island, where he remains for 30 years as pastor. but coming on the heels of him, right, and near their death, after all this stuff is happening, there are these other preachers who are rising up, who are becoming very popular.
Like Leland?
That's right.
Yeah.
One in the north and one in the south. The one in the north, actually, is in Connecticut, is Isaac Backus.
Yeah.
And then in the south, in Virginia, is John Leland.
Leland.
Although John Leland was born in Massachusetts. He later moved there, but nonetheless, both of these preachers become extremely influential, and they're advocating for religious freedom.
Right.
But not the religious freedom that the Pilgrims and the Puritans were longing for.
Which was the right to practice what they wanted.
That's right.
Well, the Pilgrims
Pilgrims were closer.
Yeah, they may have had
more. Puritans, though, were more hardliners.
It's our way, or
that's right.
Go somewhere else. You know. So,
but these guys, it was still within their purview, understanding what happened to previous Baptist ministers and people who were Baptist affiliated, the imprisonments, the beatings, and all the rest of it. And they said, man, we don't want a state church, you know. And they have a lot of influence in play in their respective states,
right?
You know, in Connecticut and also in Virginia.
Well, let's do a little backup here. Mm-hmm. You know, what's going on in Virginia and Massachusetts is different, right?
That's right.
It's nonetheless, it's still state religion. Probably should talk about, you know, the tobacco tax and such. That's probably where that discussion we need to bring that out so that we can understand the difference between what.
Go ahead and bring that.
You know, so in Virginia, as opposed to Massachusetts, you have a strong Anglican presence. Mm-hmm. I don't believe if they called it Episcopal at that point or not.
I don't know if it was Episcopal yet or not, but it was still the same roots, still Anglican.
And so everyone in Virginia had to pay taxes to the state church.
That's right.
And tobacco was the main crop, so you paid in tobacco. The churches actually had tobacco barns, and so in a way, that sort of has the same effect of what they're talking about up in the Puritan zone of no taxation without representation. You know, if you wanted to be a different religion in Virginia, you still had to pay.
That's right.
That tobacco tax.
Yeah, you could do it, but you're still essentially paying for other congregations to exist.
That's right.
You were paying for the salaries of preachers in other churches, which you did not agree with.
And so that, you know, when we talk about Backus and Leland, you know, Backus is working with Puritans over where he's at. And Leland is coming up in that Virginia tradition where he's having to pay taxes that he doesn't agree with.
That's right.
You know, and I believe he also has a moment where he's jailed and some things take place with that. Yeah,
there's some terrible. They all have essentially terrible times with one another, with the local authorities. All of them did. But I you know, their influence, it ends up on two important men for the early U.S., James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson.
Notably, both from Virginia and both members of the Democratic Republican Party.
That's right.
The Anti-Federalist, for older reference.
That's right. And Leland is, I think, the more boisterous of the two. Backus is
absolutely.
You know,
isn't Backus one of our hymn writers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. He writes a lot about, you know, what government should look like and why there should be freedom of religion and all that. But John Leland he didn't just talk about it.
Right.
That's why I think he's remembered more.
He moved around in that circle.
He did, and he was extremely important. And so they were looking at ratifying now this new constitution. Okay, for jumping ahead here.
Well, speaking of which, that it's rumored that Leland even had an effect on Washington.
Yes,
it's a possibility.
That's right.
So,
Washington also, by the way, would have had a Geneva Bible. And another interesting tidbit. This is complete rabbit, but Benjamin Franklin is said to have gotten his idea for the U.S. seal from the cover of the Geneva Bible.
Absolutely. Being a printer, that's probably he probably had to print so many Bibles to begin with because of what he was doing.
That's right. So. He liked it. He liked the cover, and that was his idea, or the inspiration for the seal.
Right.
Anyway. So these guys are, obviously Jefferson and Madison are involved in writing these documents.
Right.
Leland is essentially a poor Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
Right. But he has got, armies of people listening to his sermons. And in fact, by the time I think he's 80, they preached some 8,000 sermons. So lots of them are still available today that you can read yourself to get his own understanding. And he's speaking a lot about this idea of, what we call separation of church and state. We'll get to that in a sec. But, with Jefferson's writings of Danbury Baptist, etc. Right. But, he preached one sermon in particular called the rights of conscience inalienable, in which he said, that all men must be free. If government is going to stand at Judgment Day on your behalf, then fine. Let's have the government control it.
Right.
But if the government's not going to stand there at Judgment Day, then let them get out of it.
Right.
And let men be free. And it's very clear, I think, what he meant. And I don't know if it was so much what Jefferson and Madison meant, but when you read his sermons, and I'll get to a detail about that in a minute, I think it's very evident do
you know the year on the particular one you're mentioning?
The same year that it 1791.
Okay, so it is post Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Okay,
it's post Declaration of Independence, but when we're moving into the point of ratifying the Constitution, all right, here's where it gets interesting. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Leland, they were all friends, actually.
Right.
They knew each other. They traveled in the same circles. They spoke with each other. Jefferson is said to sit in his church and listen to his sermons.
That's saying a lot.
That is. You'd like to hear him speak, he said. He wrote about John Leland. He liked the guy. So, again, important individual. Well, when it came time for the ratifying of the Constitution, you had to run for that office, basically, to get a seat at the
state convention
right, to ratify it. Well, John Leland threw his hat in. John Leland ends up with more votes than James Madison, even though James Madison writes the document.
The author of the father of the Constitution.
That's right. He writes it. And so by that point in time, though, these two had begun to butt heads, and they weren't really talking much because Madison said, I heard your spiel about, what you think we ought to do as far as freedom of religion, but I think we don't need to. It's kind of already there, implicit.
Well, and that's an interesting thing with Madison. A lot of people don't realize is he's one of the most interesting political figures of that time. Not only because he writes the Constitution, but because he begins as a Federalist, writing the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution,
right,
to being a complete Democratic Republican that sides with Jefferson on almost everything.
That's right.
That's a complete party change. It's almost like a Paul-level conversion, if you will.
Well, and it's also, I think, there's lots of influence that comes from people like John Leland.
Right.
Because Madison was forced into certain situations.
Exactly.
By Leland.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? You're not getting elected
if you don't do this. Yeah, absolutely right. He did do that.
He did that.
Yep.
He said, I'll tell my people not to elect you.
Yep.
And
early lobbyist.
He was. Yep. I'll tell him not to elect you. And he was worried about that. And so he said, fine, I'll bring it up. And he brought it up and then dropped the idea of, the idea of religious freedom or separation of church and state as we know it today. And he drops it. But anyway, the time for the ratifying of the Constitution, Leland has more votes than Madison. So Madison and him get together because Madison really wants to ratify the document that he wrote.
Right.
And
there's a lot of things worked out like that in early American history.
There was. And so John Leland says, I will drop out of the race and give it to you on one condition, right? That you propose an amendment immediately, right? That is designed to give us complete religious freedom.
Right.
That's it.
And
there's no other way around it.
Madison obviously not being forced there because he gets on board in such a way that he writes 30 amendments to present to Congress once the Constitution is passed. 12 of those pass Congress, and then 10 of them get ratified by the states, and that's where we end up with the Bill of Rights. And so, really, Madison is their author as well. Now, the thing is, you can't leave Jefferson out of the picture. Obviously, Virginia's statute for religious freedom is super important. I mean, it's important enough to Jefferson that's one of the things on his tombstone, of which purchasing Louisiana and President of the United States is not.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting thing, that Virginia statute of religious freedom, if you read it, it's very, very close to that First Amendment.
It is.
It
is. In fact, really, Virginia, I'm trying to remember what 3 states, but there's 3 states that end up adopting as part of their state constitution some version
of that.
That's really close.
Virginia, I would think maybe Connecticut.
I think it's Connecticut. I don't remember the other state. There's another one.
And then, Rhode Island's the big holdout, so it could have been them as well. Now, at that point, Rhode Island is not the paragon of religious virtue that it was at a much earlier point. But
yeah, but so there's this influence because they didn't think it was necessary, because the Constitution was essentially devoid of religion.
Right. It was a generic secular document.
Right.
Designed to create a functional government, which it does. It does do that.
Yeah. You have no divine right of king. There's no the Constitution doesn't really define divine rights.
Right.
Not in that way.
And the majority of your anti-federalist party, which later becomes the Democratic Republicans, that's their goal. Mm-hmm. Their goal is either, like Patrick Henry, the guy that said, "Give me liberty or give me death," refused to participate with the Constitution because he felt like we had the freedom we needed with what we already had.
Exactly. Well, and that's where Madison was.
Right. Madison was there. Jefferson was leaning on that, hey, we need a Bill of Rights.
That's right. That's right. No, Jefferson was already there because of him. He and Leland were still friends, too.
That's right.
And Leland had already influenced him. It was Madison that needed to get on board.
Right.
Even more
and
so.
that probably had a lot to do with Leland, but also Jefferson, because Jefferson and Madison, they're probably one of the greatest political teams we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
that's right.
I don't know if their like has been seen since.
No, and so we're talking about the letter that Jefferson writes to Danbury Baptist. I want to talk about why he writes the letter, because there's information on the other end that seems to confirm that. But what do you think is the real impact? Is there a real impact of that letter, or is that really only in the modern era? Does that get us into the mind of Jefferson? The idea of the wall of separation between church and state that he mentions.
So we look back on it, and we think of separation of church and state as this idea where I'm protected in the state from the church. Mm-hmm. Kind of today, that's how it's looked upon. Like, I don't have to sit here and listen to this other religion's prayer. Mm-hmm. I'm protected from that by the separation of church and state.
Yeah.
But really, when Jefferson's writing that letter, he's talking about protecting the garden of the church from the wilds of the state.
That's right.
Which is a different angle.
It is a different angle. And that is it, because when he writes the letter to the Danbury Baptists, what he's trying to assure them of is, previously the colonies would have feast days or whatever, some religious observance that was enforced as a holiday.
Right. You enforced holidays.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept.
It was. You had to fast today.
But Christmas was the banned one.
Christmas, you didn't do banned.
You didn't do
There was no Christmas in early America.
That's right.
By the way. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
There was popish holidays, what they all said. But they certainly had fast days and feast days and all that. And it was declared so. Like, no, today is a fast day.
Yep.
You're like, well, I'm not Puritan. I'm Baptist. I just want to get a hamburger from the stand down the road, right? No, it's illegal to do that today. And those were the kinds of laws.
So you think that's the source of a lot of our blue laws that were around at a later
maybe
point? Makes sense.
Blue laws can trace their line back to that era, I feel like. But Jefferson was saying that there's no way this new government is going to be able to enforce fasts or prayers or these religious observances upon the people.
Right.
Because in other words, there wouldn't be.
Well, and not only that, it should
a federal religion.
It should leave that alone.
It should leave it alone completely. Right. Stay out of it. And the reason that we know that I know some like to say that that's not quite it and all that, but if you read John Leland's sermons on these issues,
Oh, he nailed it. Yeah.
he is pointed, man. He actually believes what we would say from the letter, this wall of separation.
I think you could find the text of the First Amendment, the literal text of the First Amendment.
Oh, it's in his sermons.
It's in John Leland's sermon.
Absolutely.
And I would, yes, Jefferson crafted it. Yes, Madison finally put it forward. But yeah. Leland is the origin.
Sure. He had power over both of them in that sense. And what he didn't want was he fought for the freedom of all to worship as they chose.
Right.
Sole competency. It was a theological perspective,
right,
that he was going at, right? That each one of us is accountable ourselves.
Yeah, the government can't save you.
The government can't save you.
That's your position with God, not the government.
Another interesting note. I want to read a quote by him. Two of them actually.
Who's this?
John Leland.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In a sermon on July 4th. All right.
Interesting date.
Yeah, 1802. Never promote men who seek after a state-established religion. It is a spiritual tyranny, the worst of despotism. It is turnpiking the way to heaven by human law in order to establish ministerial gates to collect toll. It converts religion into a principle of state policy and the gospel into merchandise. Heaven forbids the bonds of marriage between church and state. Their embraces, therefore, must be unlawful. So,
man, you can almost trace some of that to Luther.
You can. Luther, it sounds Lutheran, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that the selling of the indulgences was,
Exactly. This joining together of
church and state.
Church and state. He, on another issue of people who are running for office, he has another quote here I'd like to bring up. It's the same sermon on the 4th of July, which is again interesting date, but
you have the year on that?
It is 1802.
Okay, so Jefferson's president at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And about to run for office. Not yet running for his second term.
That's right. Okay. So he says this about people running for office, which is I find fascinating because
it would have been a congressional midterm. So,
well, it's fascinating in the sense because today I don't think there's many people that would accept what he's saying, but these are the traditional understandings of what this separation of church and state
it really means.
Yeah. He says this: guard against those men who make a great noise about religion. Remember, he didn't like people running for office using religion.
Right.
In choosing representatives, specifically think about representatives, it is electioneering. If they knew the nature and worth of religion, they would not debauch it in such shameful purposes. If pure religion is the criterion to denominate candidates, those who make a noise about it must be rejected. For their wrangle about it proves that they are void of it.
Right.
I mean, he is.
If you're bragging, you can't be humble. I mean, it's nailing it, right?
If you're saying you need to elect me because I'm a Christian, or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Puritan, or I'm a what, he said, no, that needs to be.
That's a reason not to elect.
That's right. That's a reason not to elect them. Elect somebody else. And this is a famous preacher and theologian, and really, I would argue, in a sense, a political force. I mean, if there's anybody in early America that could influence Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, that fellow was something.
Right. And just look at the First Amendment for a second. I'm going from memory here, but Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion.
Yeah.
In other words, they can't make a law with the purpose of making a state-sponsored religion. That's separation of church and state right there on the spot. You're basically saying that religion is the purview of someone else, not the state.
That's right.
And then it goes on to say, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's still in that sole competency realm
where I get to decide for myself.
That's right.
what I believe, how I live, what my morals are, my ideology about God or whatever.
Connecting that to Jefferson's already present views on individual freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty strong.
It was a powerful bond, right?
Right.
Those I think those three individuals, John Leland, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, those three coming together, that's it. That's the reason that we have the Bill of Rights.
Right. Well, yeah, and then on the opposite side of that, you've got who? Hamilton and Adams, and we can get into a big discussion on those things.
Yeah. Well, but
the play kind of makes Jefferson and Madison the bad guys. But if you really get into looking at that, yes,
Hamilton is something.
They are the bad guy in one department, but in everything else,
yeah,
they pretty much got the right idea.
That's right.
What
we think about today, most of the rights that people talk about that they have, that people would sue for,
right?
Civil rights issues and stuff.
But just look at the first five.
Yeah, they're coming from this initial bill,
right?
Not from later stuff or from other places. They're coming from amendments. Right. This first real big amendment.
And out of those 10 amendments, religion is first.
That's right.
That says something right there. Mm-hmm. It comes before speech in the list.
They did not want another time when there would be someone who is in civil authority over them who would try to enforce any spiritual
decrees of any sort.
That's right.
Yeah. Or a tobacco tax.
That's right.
It's got to go. Right.
But this is at the federal level.
Yeah. State level's a different story.
State was a different animal.
And in some ways, that's going to be interesting if we get to talk about that, is because Jefferson and Madison have a different view of that. Mm-hmm. That the state should have its purview over certain things.
Yeah.
And that comes from a totally different political
it does
debate.
But the same people like Leland Bacchus were against it in all forms, no matter if it was from federal government, state government,
state, right?
And a lot of the early colonies, they did have their state-run religions. In fact, Massachusetts
held on to it for a while.
1880s or something.
It's late.
It's very late. It's after the Civil War, I know. Yeah. Before Massachusetts finally got rid of the state religion.
Now, they do have one of the older surviving constitutions that hasn't been amended very much.
Yeah.
From that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, they held on to that for a while. We have to look up the exact detail on that.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact detail. I know it was late. I know it was after the Civil War. I thought it was around 1880-ish when they were the last state.
Not to get too political on this, but when we start digging into Federalist versus Democratic Republican, Massachusetts is the hotbed of Federalists. Mm-hmm. That's where it's at. That's where the Federalist homestead would be.
Well, but do you think, though, that Massachusetts, it's sort of the legacy of the Puritans?
Absolutely.
That
kept that Federalist viewpoint where you put in an electoral college where the people do not vote on the president directly and things like that. That comes from the Federalists. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that and you compare that to Puritanism, it's very similar.
Yeah.
Like their view of what freedom is and who should be in charge is different than Jefferson, Madison, the Democratic Republicans, and who they view as, eventually the people. Government of the people, by the people, to quote Lincoln,
sure,
for the people.
Since you brought up Lincoln, another side note here: Obadiah Holmes is the ancestor of Abraham Lincoln, by the way. Also, so that's
very interesting.
That is interesting that happened. But so that gives us sort of, I think, a good overview, kind of the early religious.
That's a lot to talk about.
It is. It
really is.
There's a lot happening. It's happening fairly quickly, I think, because there's so many new people coming in different groups with different ideas, but some of them have more power than others, right. And
if you look at something like Pennsylvania, when we talk about America as a melting pot, you've got the Quakers.
Pennsylvania, I think, is a picture of the melting pot.
Yeah, definitely. You've got the, Pennsylvania Dutch coming in, they're really German. You've got all these different groups. You might have even had Oh, I don't want to quote that, but there may have been some Anabaptists there. There's
It may have been.
There's so many different groups coming into there. You have Mennonites, Amish.
Yeah. Well, they're Anabaptists,
right?
I mean,
well, there it is. I was right about that.
yeah. So that's that overview I think would help some people that don't really understand that, because I think looking back, we get when the Mayflower came over, and we talk about the Pilgrims a bit, and we think that whatever their view was, that was the view of America, and it's the same view that we have today.
Well, I mean, to put out another plug for a future conversation is, look at where the abolitionist movement starts.
Mm-hmm.
It's Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I mean, your Quakers.
Absolutely.
Franklin's the first abolitionist society. He creates the first one in America. Their viewpoint on
they were more human rights,
right?
And and you can see what happens even later with like Underground Railroad and where people are going, and the roots of the people who help to get people out of slavery. I think you could trace it back to that time period too. The early foundations of that.
Absolutely.
It had always been present in America.
Right.
The idea that you shouldn't have slaves.
The Southerners called it the peculiar institution. They knew where it rested, but I mean that's an argument for another time.
Sure.
But and we'll have to get into Jefferson, Madison again with that. But I mean it's interesting that they had the right viewpoints
on something
on that political freedom.
That's right. But others maybe not,
and others not so much.
Yeah, because Jefferson, like on the whole slavery issue, what are they supposed to do if I turn people loose? Are they going to go get a job?
Yeah.
No.
Right. Well, and he, probably would have freed his slaves.
Yeah.
But he was in such debt at the end, he literally couldn't do it.
Yeah. It was where it's such a complicated path. People have such complicated lives. Nobody's flat.
Right.
There are no flat characters in actual history.
Right.
People, they make good decisions, do good things. They also do some things that you think, why did they do that? And then they do some pretty terrible things sometimes too.
Well, I mean, Andrew Jackson, vilified today, right? He's vilified. He's literally, we're canceling him.
Sure. The Indian Removal Act and all that mess.
But at the time, the American voter, Jackson's exactly what they wanted.
Yeah.
Now, when we're defining who the American voter is,
in all that too.
Right.
So that was, I think, the largest.
I tell my students all the time, if you're a 2-term president, that says something.
Yeah.
All our 1-termers, you can see the faults, the problem.
Yeah.
But the 2-termers, that's telling you something.
That's right.
And look, as much as we vilify him, he's a 2-termer.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll have to do another time is pick up the conversation here, essentially take it from the early United States, when no longer colonies, were independent, and sort of look at maybe these great awakenings that happened and the spiritual formation of the U.S. and how some things change.
Right.
And maybe try to compare that to today.
Right. And that
difference.
Speaking of which, that's starting in the Puritan zone, right? The first Great Awakening.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Which is isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, things come full circle eventually. You get like Jonathan Edwards, coming from that Puritan mindset.
Right. Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us this time. See you guys next time.